Well, good evening, everyone. I am so thrilled that we are here tonight with author Marina Budhos. Before I introduce her and share a little bit about her, I want to introduce some of our wonderful staff that's on tonight. We have Sarah Knutson, who's a English teacher at River Middle School, and we're happy to have her. I know, Sarah, if you want to say hi.
Yes, Sarah Knutson, super excited to be here. We have an awesome teacher session with Marina earlier this afternoon, and I'm excited for all of us to hear what she has to say tonight.
Thank you, Sarah. And then we also have our wonderful webmaster, Megan is here. So thank you, Megan, for being able to be here and helping us host this. We have Kate McMillan, our district library services coordinator. Kate, I don't know if you want to say just good evening to everyone. Kate is probably,
right.
There you go. Go ahead, Kate.
Oh, I'm so excited to have Marina. As you know, our relationship extends beyond this first time. I'm great friends with her husband, who is also her author partner. It's the writing family. So welcome again, Marina.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And then we also have our interpreter, Isidra, who is going to share how to get to the interpretation channel. So Isidra, did you want to go ahead and share that information so we can get started?
Sure. Buenas tardes a todos. La reunión de hoy va a tener interpretación en español. Para poder escuchar la reunión en español, en breves momentos ustedes van a ver un icono del globo terráqueo en la parte de abajo de su pantalla de Zoom. Pueden hacer clic en el icono y escoger el idioma español o Spanish. Gracias.
Gracias. And so now I see the interpretation channel is up. So we are going to get started. So tonight, as I mentioned, this is our final authors night in our series in our literacy initiative. And we are so grateful to have Marina Budhos here tonight. The book that we are going to talk about is The Long Ride. That's one of the many books that she's written. This book in particular struck me just even from the very front inside book cover, where it talks about in 1971, a time of bell bottoms and cool boots and a time of big change. And what struck me is that I was 6 years old at this time, and I was one of those students who got on a bus and took a long ride. And so this book really spoke to me. So I'm so excited to have Marina here tonight. And I'm just gonna go ahead and have her introduce herself and just share a little bit about herself and her journey as a writer. So go ahead, Marina.
So hello, everybody. It's a delight to be here. And so, you know, one of the things is I'm often asked, did you always know you wanted to be a writer? You know, was it always clear to you that you wanted to be a writer? And, you know, I like to tell just a quick little story, which is that both my parents were teachers, actually. My dad was a math teacher. My mother ultimately became an English teacher. And my dad, I was the younger sibling, and my brother went off to school, and he would come home with these stacks of books and friends, and I was incredibly jealous. So I thought somehow reading would be sort of the opening of all of the experiences he was having. So I begged my mother to teach me how to read at home, which she did. And sometimes I think she did it to get back to her own reading, if I could be a little bit quieter. So my father brought home an old Dick and Jane book, one of those readers they used to use. And I remember staring at the picture, which was of a little Sally staring at a rain puddle. And she's staring at it. And I invented a whole story about what was going on and how her brother and sister had been mean to her and all these things that had happened. It was very elaborate. And then I learned how to read. And the only thing it said on that page was the word see. And then after that, it says see Sally. And my immediate feeling actually was incredible disappointment. Like, this is what reading's going to get me to? See, I could do much better than that. And I always like to think of that story because, one, it showed, I guess, a certain moxie desire on my own part to make up my own stories and to sort of write into the text. But ultimately, in a way, I do think that word see was a really important word, because see is definitely a guiding principle for me as a writer. It means that you're always watching and you're looking and you're observing. To see is one of the most important aspects. To bear witness, that really is one of the most important words when I think about it. Despite my 3-year-old disappointment, see is an awfully important word.
Thank you. I would completely agree. The ability to see, whether it's to see yourself or see others and see them as sort of fully human beings, is really important. And that often is what happens when we read, books that are not about, ourselves, that are a little different. I don't know, Sarah, did you have a question that you want to follow up with?
Yeah, actually, hearing you talk about being so disappointed by this first reading experience, I wonder if as you grew as a reader, if there began to come up any authors who you started to look up to or admire.
So, I think I was a classic kid in that way of, like, once I fell into reading, right? And even though my mother taught me how to read at home, and I did read, I do remember really learning how to read in first grade and begging her to write my first grade teacher a letter of gratitude. I had no idea, again, how prescient this would be. But in terms of early books, or books that, I feel I did really like some of those classic children's literature. I mean, The Secret Garden is probably my all-time favorite children's book. I know that there's all kinds of critiques about it, but it's a book that I read over and over again, and I read over and over again to my kids. So, if I think about one of those sweet spot moments when one is about 8 or 9, I would say The Secret Garden holds that treasured place. The other thing that happened for me as I was, again, sort of falling up into reading is I was both reading young adult novels, be Paul Zindel, or all of those kind of classic, Are You There, God, Margaret, all of those classic novels. But I was also starting to steal the paperbacks off my mother's shelf. So there's a theme here. And I was very drawn to them because they seemed to be illicit, and I wasn't supposed to be reading them. She was actually getting her doctorate at the time, so her serious books were up in her bedroom, but these paperbacks were in the dining room, and one by one I would make my way through them. And they were actually they tended to be urban books. They tended to be very contemporary, up the down staircase. I guess I liked that grittiness in a way. So I was kind of reading up, and then I was reading the classic YA books. And then I finally made my way up into her bedroom and started, working my way from Jane Austen onward.
Those are some serious book reading for, what age were you?
The Jane Austen came in high school, I would say.
Okay.
So we got up to the bedroom later. But yeah, that would have been later. But, I think I was one of those kids, if you put it in, it was like a good eater. If you put it in front of me, I'd want to dive into it. I remember at 13, a book that really affected me actually was Black Boy. And it wasn't an assigned book. For some reason, I had picked it up. Maybe it was one of the books in my mother's paperback. And I guess I wanted a sort of edgier if not contemporary, but something that was sort of making me uncomfortable and a little bit edgier. So I think I was seeking that out after being in the sweet spot of children's literature.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I know that for myself, like I remember reading Man-Child in the Promised Land, which is a pretty gritty novel for a high school student, and at the same time being totally enamored with Harlequin romance as well. Like this whole like this sort of weird sort of dichotomy between the two. I'm curious, like what's your process as a writer? Many of our authors that have shared their stories, sort of like, how do you come up with ideas? What's the process like? How long does it take typically from sort of the thought in your head to actual like story or novel? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the interesting things is because I bounce between nonfiction and fiction, although I think of myself as my first muse, my first love being fiction, although I have this nonfiction bent, it seems like I want that to be a part of the storytelling. And nonfiction is like a very, very close second. So sometimes ideas, it's a question of which genre, something might interest me. And I spend a lot of time wrestling with whether it belongs as a fictional story or it's something I want to explore in nonfiction. And The Long Ride's a good example of that. In The Long Ride, I was actually writing some autobiographical material, and I had published a few personal essays, and I was sort of diving into this memoir-like material. And it had a lot to do with growing up mixed, the era I grew up in, and things I wanted to capture. So I came upon this moment in my community when this school busing crisis happened. And I wasn't a part of it, though. And so I still knew I wanted to do something with it. And so that's when the wheels began turning, where I decided to go into invention. And that's where sort of the seed of The Long Ride, where I said, okay, I've got the milieu from a kind of nonfiction perspective, but this isn't about me per se. I really want to go into invention. So I tend to make a lot of notes and talk to myself. My journal has become less about what happened to me, what I ate for lunch or whatever, and more my thinking process as I try to sort this out. I think there's another thing that happens for me with some of the novels, and I'm sort of talking about novels right now, is sometimes I'll have an idea banging around in my head, and maybe in a sense it's a nonfiction idea. For instance, Watched is another novel which was about a Muslim boy who decides to become an informant. And it's all about surveillance. And I knew I had this idea about surveillance. I was following what was going on, but I didn't have a story. I mean, that's an idea. That's an atmosphere. And I think a writer is always a magpie. Again, if they're not only seeing, they're listening. And I sat down to dinner one night with a friend, and she was a lawyer. And she told me about a young man who had waltzed into her office and in confidence had boasted to her that he was an informant. And he was also sort of lording it over his father, who was a shopkeeper. All of a sudden, this whole world, this whole character came to me as I was listening to her. And he also felt trapped because he was spying on his own community and he was being used. And I realized at that moment, I had my character, I had my dilemma. So I think some of the thinking process has to do with starting with an idea, but letting it sit with myself so that I can feel the character and the internal dilemma that will make a story.
That's, yeah. As an English teacher, that's constantly what I tell my students, is this idea of playing with an idea and kind of letting it sit. And we actually just talked about the so what today, and this idea that sometimes you get partway through a story and you have to set it aside for a little while until you find that so what, which it sounds like you really have. You mentioned one of the characters in Watched, but heading back to The Long Ride, which character do you most connect with?
So there is no doubt in my mind that The Long Ride probably of, I'm just thinking out loud now, and I do, yes, I think it may be the most overtly autobiographical in that sense. And as I mentioned, this particular novel began with material that was autobiographical. I really wanted to explore that 12 to 13 cusp moment, which was so vivid to me. It's still very vivid to me. In fact, let's see if I can, I'm going to see, I'm going to quickly share a screen because I'm going to even show you that I still have my, one second, I still have my diary. That little orange from that 12 to 13 moment.
I love it.
And actually, I just want to quickly show you, I promise I'll swing back. I used to cartoon or draw a lot, draw my stories. So when you talk about your students, I always encourage visualization in a way. And so one of the things I did is I watched a lot of television. I was a good reader, but I watched a lot of TV. I will be perfectly honest. But what I would do is, again, I would stay up late at night and rewrite the script. I guess it was that same thing that I felt I could do better. And so that was me kind of lying in bed when my mother was telling me, go to sleep. And I was rewriting the script and acting it out in my mind. And then eventually I started writing novels. So that's from diary to novel. But anyway, I'm going to stop that share. Going back to The Long Ride. So most certainly the main character is who I identify with. I feel that Jamila is, she's sort of closest to me, and some of the emotions she feels, and even some of the experiences she had in the middle school or in the junior high she went to, were somewhat plucked from my experience. Not so much a busing experience, but going to a kind of rough school where she was sort of from that sweet, more contained world at 12, and then being sent into this junior high and very, very confused and a little bit tough, some tough experiences. So I'm most identified with her.
I'm super intrigued by the picture you just showed. You had the diary, but then you also had some houses on stilts.
Yes, I'm sorry. I skipped over that. I'm going to show you that quickly.
I'm curious.
Hold on a second. So what was that? So what happened was when I was 9, so this is a little before the diary, I wrote my first novel when I was 9. Frankly, it was a lift off of a movie that I had seen called, Run Wild, Run Free, which was with Mark Lester, the British actor who played Oliver in the original Oliver. Anyway, I came up with this whole novel that I was scribbling and writing. And so when I went away to summer camp for the first time, so that's an image of summer camp, I would sneak out of the bunks and scribble by the stream during nap time so that I could work on my novel. So that was my first attempt at writing a novel.
I think that is pretty amazing. I think that students, all students have in them sort of that those stories, and some have like an extra passion to sort of get that down in writing. Do you have any advice for students who might be a little more reluctant, or to parents who are on this call who have students who might not be as excited about putting their thoughts and ideas onto paper? Like, what things help you?
I have another little cartoon, by the way. So let's see if we can get to that cartoon. That's me, the grumpy author. So one other thing I always tell students, because as you can see, I sometimes do a certain amount of research with respect to my, let's see, we could put that, with respect to, yeah, there we go, grumpy author. And you know, one bit of advice I often give is so if you're researching something, to not let it overwhelm you, right? I have this fight of the pens where research is kind of battling imagination. And at the end of the day, I think it's important to pay attention to imagination. I think it's important to pay attention to what you have to say, and then you can fill in the rest of it. You can always fill it in. So that's one thing I would say. I think the other thing is to recognize, and I'm sure that any writer who's ever been up before an audience will say this, that revision is actually your friend. So often in other parts of our life, it's about that one chance. You know, you're called on and you have to speak, and you better get it right what you're trying to say. You fill out a form and you better fill out the form correctly. Well, the wonderful thing about writing is that's that one part of life where it isn't about the one time. I like to say that it's unlike baseball where it's 3 strikes, you're out. Here it's like 15 strikes and you're still not out, because in fact, it gets better the more you revise. I like to think of writing where, you know, the first one is, it's just getting something out. It's getting an impulse out. Follow the impulse, follow the instincts. If you're having trouble writing, just keep your hand moving across the page or your fingers typing. There may be a whole lot that you get rid of, but it's better to keep moving, because you always have another chance and another chance and another chance. So it's to really dispel the idea that everything you put down is so precious. It really isn't. It's just part of your process.
I love that. We've been working a lot on revision this year, and honestly, as a sometimes writer, I hate it. I want it to be perfect the first time out of the gate, and I know it's not going to be. So I've been trying, as I'm teaching my students this, that I'm teaching myself as well, that this revision process is so important. And honestly, as students turn in their work again, it just gets better and better. I've had students
always, yes,
ask for feedback, and then they turn it in, and at the end they're like, "Oh wow, I did that," and they feel that process, and it's so wonderful. I know one thing that the students love to ask all the time is also about like the world outside of being an author. So if you could tell us a little bit about your life beyond the page, what else goes into your world?
You know, I actually think that's a great question. Sorry, I was trying to share the screen, and of course that didn't work. I was going to show you one other image, but it's okay. I think that's a really important question. I am not a person, you know, there was a time in my life, I feel very guilty about, let me just put this out there. I feel very guilty becoming a writer. You know, my father was an immigrant, and I thought, you know, he came to this country and worked so hard for me to like make no money and be an obscure writer. That's not what it was supposed to be for. You know, I was supposed to do something else. And so I felt a very, very profound sense of guilt when I I actually went to graduate school for creative writing. And so what I did was I said, all right, I'm treating it like a job. It's my job. And I would get up every morning, and I lived in a tiny apartment, and I was very, very strict with myself. Now, I will say that created tremendous discipline in me. And there were certain kind of patterns that I developed. Like I tend to like to write early in the morning when your mind is kind of fresh driven snow. It hasn't been sullied by many other things. But that was easier to do when I was in graduate school. You know, life goes on, life gets complicated. I'm the mother of 2 teenage boys. Actually, one of them isn't even a teenager anymore. He's a college junior. So life is very noisy and complicated. What I have discovered is I'm somebody who has to be fed if I'm going to be creative. Fed in so many other ways, fed with the noise of family life, as much as it drives me crazy. Also fed, I'm very much fed by the other arts. I'm fed by museums, and I'm fed by being curious and exploring, and sort of feeding that curiosity. And before I know it, you know, you asked, where do I get ideas? I always carry a notebook around. And before I know it, you know, I'm getting ideas rather than when I'm staring at my screen. So, you know, sorry, see, noise of
That's perfectly timed, right?
But yes, so, you know, I think I've even gotten a little looser in that way, because, for instance, I'll give you a really good example. As I mentioned, art and photography are things that feed me a lot. And I went to this photography show about Robert Capa, the photojournalist, and discovered that there was this woman photographer called Gerda Taro. The exhibit just blew me away. She was the first woman war photographer. I knew nothing about her. And ultimately, that became a book that my husband Mark and I wrote. I didn't know that when I went to the exhibit. So again, you know, I would share that I think living and responding is so important to sort of opening a writer's pores.
And I think one of the things that you shared, I think we heard from every single other author that typically they carry, you know, a notebook or they carry something around. We had one author that shared on the back of the Costco receipt, they had written a chapter or the beginnings of a chapter for one of his stories. And I think that that's key, is that idea that when it pops into your head, to find a place to put that idea down. I want to open up the floor and see if there are any questions. So we're going to use the raise hand feature. So if you have a question for Marina Budhos, please raise your hand. Or if you have something that you want to share, go ahead and do that. We're going to see if any hands pop up. I know we have a couple of students on this call. We have some students on this call, so I do see, okay, I see a hand. So Megan, if you can unmute Monica Reddy. So go ahead and what question do you have?
Hi, I'm Addison, and my question is, what's the favorite book? What is your favorite book that you wrote?
Oh, what is my favorite book? That's like asking which is your favorite child of your children. It's a really tough question because you love them all in different ways. And it's very, very hard. I will say, so I'll tell you how I love certain ones, because that's really what it more feels like. So I wrote a novel, Ask Me No Questions, and I love that novel because it burned out of me with a kind of urgency. And it was a really intense experience, and I'm very proud of that book. I have to say, I love The Long Ride because it allowed me to, as I said, be back into being 12 again. So it has a kind of sweet place in my, among all the books. It feels very sweet for me. And then I mentioned this nonfiction book I wrote, Eyes of the World. Again, sorry, I keep adding to the list, but I did love writing that book and being in the world of that book. So they're each different. You love them in different ways, but those three, oh, there's more, but I'm going to stop right there.
I know it's hard, like asking a writer to say what's your favorite book, even of your own, is hard. And
I just realized what it is. When you are writing that book, whatever book you're writing, once you commit to it, you are in love with that book. You have to be. You're also, in hate with it. Because what you love, you hate, right? It's driving you crazy. And I'll even give you another writer's confession. I was working on a new novel for my publisher, and I wrote the whole draft of it, and I was not in love with it. I liked the idea. I loved the idea, but it didn't work. And I sat down, I pulled the characters out, and I wrote a new novel, Soup to Nuts, that I love more. So it's more who you're loving while you're writing.
That's really critical. I see another hand up. Jennifer Strowman, do you have a question? So to make sure you unmute, Jennifer.
Yeah, it's still.
So Jennifer, I think she's probably trying to find her unmute button.
Oh.
Sometimes it takes a little while.
Yeah.
Talking is permit. There she goes.
I know, it took a second. It decided to, I don't know what it did, but we're here now. My daughter Liliana actually had a question.
Great.
How many books have you written?
So I have written more books than I published. See, it's two different questions, right? So I've written lots of books, and I like that one when I was 9, and I still haven't published it, and I'm mad about that. It's in my attic somewhere, I think. But so I've written a lot of books, or started a lot of books and stopped them. But I've published, I'm trying to remember now, I think it's 9 books. I think.
That's a really good sign if you have to think about how many books you've published, as opposed to I have 2 or whatever. So thank you. Jennifer, what's your daughter's name?
Liliana.
Thank you, Liliana.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Our next hand is Mel Alvarez.
Hi. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
we can.
Okay. I was just trying to figure out how to unmute. So what year did you publish your first book?
What year did I? Oh boy, you're really that. You guys are really getting me to scratch. So I published my first book in 1995. That was an adult novel. I will tell you that before I published novels, I wrote short stories. And so I published a lot of short stories as I was learning, because learning how to write a novel is a whole other beast. But once I learned how to write a novel, and every novel is different, but once I started going into the long form, I just didn't look back, because I think I'm more comfortable. I occasionally will publish a story here and there, and I do shorter works, but I love the long form. I want to sink into the world of a book. So 1995 was the first, book where I'd sunk in, and I finally published it.
And Mel, do you like reading short stories, or do you like reading novels?
I don't really know. I just like reading in general, so I don't have a favorite.
That's great. Awesome. That's great. Liking to read in general is terrific, actually.
Yeah. My friends think I'm crazy because I actually like to read.
Oh, you are not crazy.
No.
Grow their minds. Share all your books.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions, Mel?
Not that I can think of right now.
Okay, thank you, Mel, for joining us tonight.
You're welcome.
The next hand we have up is Joshua.
What is the newest book you've published?
So the newest book I've published is this book, The Long Ride, which is what I guess, you know, many of you have started or some of you are reading. And that is the middle grade novel that is about 3 girls. It's a kind of friendship novel, I think. I often talk about it as a novel about school integration and what happens, but I also think it's just a novel about being 12 and what happens to your friendships as you move on to middle school, because very often friendships really change at that moment. And this is a trio of friends that have always been together and hung together.
Can you relate to that, Joshua?
Yeah, I can.
What grade are you in?
I'm in 6th grade.
Okay, so there you go. Exactly. My characters they've just left 6th grade and it was different in those days. You went to junior high in 7th grade, right? I know now middle school tends to start in 6th grade. So it's that changeover, right? It's a big change, isn't it?
Yeah.
6th grade is the new 7th grade.
Exactly.
So.
It's the 7th grade. Yeah.
Joshua, do you have any other questions?
No, all right.
Then I have a question for you, because you asked Mrs. Budhos what was her last book that she wrote. What was the last book that you read?
It's called, I have it right here. It's called Marcos Vega Doesn't Speak Spanish.
Ah, that's awesome. That was our last author. Did you join that night when Bill Cartea was here?
No.
No. But that's good. I heard that. I mean, I know it's a great story. So hopefully you're enjoying it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joshua. Okay, I see Mel, you have another question?
Yes. So the last question actually got me thinking. What is your favorite book that you like to read that is not the one that you wrote?
Right. So the favorite books that I like to read. So this is one of those questions where the expression deer in the headlights, try to remember. Because like you, Mel, I love to read. And, people often ask me, what's your favorite book? And that's a really hard question. Right now I'm not at home, right? But normally I do my Zooms from my office and you'd see all my books. And I love having my books next to me because I look at them longingly, remembering the reading experience. So it's going to be hard for me to tell you one favorite book. I go through phases of certain books, but I will tell you one of my favorite books is by a writer. She's an adult author, Toni Morrison, but the book that I love of hers is called Sula. And it's a beautiful book. And actually it's about, maybe when you're a little older, you can read it. I read it in college. But it's about a friendship, actually. It's about 2 girls growing up. And I thought it captured some beautiful things about friendship. So that's one of my favorite novels. I think I mentioned that when I was a kid, The Secret Garden was one of my favorite books. And I'm trying to think of some other books. Now, this is going to sound kind of silly, but so when I was growing up, we didn't have much family in the US, but we had family that had immigrated to England. So we would go spend our summers with them. So I actually grew up reading a lot of British children's books. And there were the early books that I read when I was there were called the Naughty books. And it was, nobody here knows the Naughty books, but the Naughty books was a whole world of characters, a land that was made out of toys, like block toys. And
Yeah.
I loved those books. So it's interesting what you hold on to.
Yeah.
Do you know what your favorite book is?
That's hard too. So one of them is Where the Red Fern Grows. And I think my other one is I have to say The Hunger Games.
Oh yeah, that's so good. That's good. Yeah.
Thank you, Mel, for sharing and for asking some questions. And we have one more hand up, Joshua, and then we'll see if we have any final thoughts or questions from either Sarah or Marina. So Joshua, did you have another question?
Yeah. When did you start thinking you're gonna be an author?
So as I mentioned, I was always scribbling. I was always writing. I wanted to be a writer in many, many ways, but being a writer kind of, to actually do it scared me a little bit. So the way I convinced myself to be a writer was after college. I worked for a few years, and then I went to graduate school for writing. And as I mentioned earlier, I treated it like a job, because I figured if I could be serious about it like a job, then maybe I could do it. And so it was really a few years after college that I settled down and got serious about being a writer. But I think secretly I always hoped I could be a writer.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. So Sarah, did you have any last questions before I toss to Marina for some closing comments?
Yes, I was actually wondering, you mentioned like this idea of falling in love with the characters as you start writing, and as you're still kind of in the throes of the long ride and sharing all about that, have you started to fall in love with any new characters that you're working on?
So I'm a person who tends to have a few projects, like it's like having a stove where you have different pots, or when you're cooking, you're multitasking, and some things are more ready than other things. So I always tend to have several things going. It's just some are more active than not. So I actually just handed in the rough draft of a new novel to my editor. And I would say, up until about a week ago, that was what I was intensely involved and in love with. That was where I scrapped the original one and tried to idea with the same character was filling my head, handed it over to her. And I will confess, I'm one of these people that when I finish something, whatever draft, if I hand it to someone else, I actually don't think about it that much. It's like I need a break from that person. I need a break from that world. And sometimes I take some notes because other things occur to me, but I like to push it off to someone else to read. So I'm now while my editor is reading that novel, I had started an adult novel a while ago, and I'm now returning to that. So I'm now just starting to sink back into that world.
Thank you. I love that idea of these multiple stories kind of flowing all at once. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And so, Marina, I don't know if you have any last things you want to share. You were kind of freezing up a little bit, so I'm not sure if you're having some internet issues.
Are you guys hearing me? Because I think, yeah.
We can hear you now, but you're freezing up every now and then. Love, love, love technology. Oh, we lost her. Oh, wait, she's coming back on. Hold on. Oh, she turned her camera off. There we go. Are you good? Can you hear us? You're muted. While you're doing that, I was wondering, Mel, did you have another question?
There. Okay.
Okay, hold on a second, Marina. I
back.
want to see if we have one last hand up. And Mel, did you have another question that you wanted to ask before we close up?
Yes, I actually thought of this. My very last question. Do you like to read multiple books at a time?
Great question. Great question. Yes, I do. And I'll tell you, because partly it's you just don't know what mood you're going to be in at a given time. So I tend to have a few books going. It's just like the cooking I said before, like the same is true for me of books. And I will also say that when you write, you're kind of a weird reader, because sometimes books, you have to avoid certain books because you're afraid they'll go into your head and over influence you. So I'm always moving around in my reading a little bit. So yes, I tend to usually at least have one nonfiction and one fiction book, but maybe a couple more are going on.
Okay.
Great
Thank
question.
Do you like to read more than one book at a time?
Yes.
And can you keep it, you feel like you can keep it in your head, the different books?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a great question, Mel, because I think it does come down to like, I tend to like read a book and I won't stop until I finish it. Like, but I tend to do like marathon reading, as opposed to a little bit every day. Cause I like to get to the end of the story. It's the impatient part of me. But so that's sort of where I land, but that's a great question, Mel. Thanks for asking it. And Marina, do you have any closing remarks or anything else you want to share with our group tonight?
Yeah, one thing I want to just share with everybody is what I want, and if all of you who read and all of you who are probably doing some writing for school in some way, is to not be intimidated by either reading or writing, okay? Sometimes we have books where we're not excited about them, and that's okay. That's an okay reaction to have. And sometimes we return to those books and we may appreciate them later. Maybe we never do, but it's not a test. Reading is never a test. The other thing I wanted to say about writing is the revision process, but I also wanted to say, always keep in mind that write only what you can write. Sure, we learn from other people, but think about who you are and what excites you. And I promise you that will show up on the page.
What great last words to leave us with. I think it's so incredibly true. To write what you know and write what speaks to you and write what you enjoy, because it comes through in the writing, and it clearly comes through in your writing. It's definitely been a pleasure to talk with you and to read your book, The Long Ride, and have an opportunity to share you with Napa Valley Unified School District. So thank you so much. You are final author this year, and I'm so sad that this is the last author talk that we have, but I'm eager to start planning for next year. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, and enjoy your time in New Orleans, because I know that's where you are.
Yes.
Have some beignets at Cafe du Monde for me.
Oh, we've
And-
already had some, even in the rain that's coming down, but this is a good example of me kind of feeding myself in between projects. So there you go.
Oh, great. So thank you so much. You guys have a great evening. Thank you,
and
Sarah, for joining us and and co-hosting with me, and Megan for being our lovely web host, and for Isidra for being our interpreter tonight. And then Kate, thank you for joining us. Did you have something to say, Kate?
Yes, I do. I always have something at the end, library. And make sure that I want to remind all of you that we have Marina's a lot of and Mark's books in your libraries, and of course on Sora. So yeah, there are multiple copies. So go and read.
Thank you. Those are the perfect last words. Go and read. Everyone have a great night. Thank you.
And thank you all. Thank you for having me.